camping nightmares, and getting a feel for the true monster. This is a 6-part series of the same story, of which you are listening to part 2 of 6. Let's get started.
Okay, you guys, so based on my last one, I had quite a few people who were confused and wanted me to elaborate a few things, which I was just fine with. As mentioned in one of my comments, this woman has done some terrible things to me and my family, and I don't mind talking it out because this is cheaper than therapy. If you guys want more detailed stories about Monster, then please let me know and I will get into more stories about her. I don't mind. Also, I will try to use MIL for mother-in-law, Phil for father-in-law, and Monster more often so I don't confuse people between my parents and in-laws. So here we go. I guess we should start off with how this all came about. So, in my last post, I let everyone know the start was my husband and I got together and I got to meet his wonderful parents. Well, their family had a fire on Valentine's Day at the beginning of 2014, which stressed my MIL out to the point that she had a heart attack after moving into their newly built home at the end of the year. We were all incredibly saddened by her death. No one could ever explain to me how I knew this woman for less than a year, and it hurt so badly to lose her. I remember pulling up to my husband's home at the time, tears in my eyes, as I embraced my husband and begged him to tell me that everything was all right. He held me so tight and whispered through startled breaths that she was gone. He had found her lifeless body that morning. When my Phil came home, my husband rushed to his side and tried to tell him that his mother was gone. We later found out how incredibly devastating this was for my Phil because this was the only morning he was late and forgot to kiss his wife goodbye. I cannot stress the pain that man must have felt. They got married very young and had been together for at least 30 years at that point. My Phil shoved my husband to the side and raced for the door. When you walk inside, it is nothing but sadness and pain. Nothing more heartbreaking than watching my father in his chair, crying in agony, begging for God's help, and just trying to figure out what he is going to do without her in his life. I will explain this part in detail, simply because if more people request stories about Monster, there is another part to this that will come back later to make you hate this woman as much as we did. Anyway, about a year later, my Phil was still heavily grieving. It was so bad, he had forgotten how to smile. You could never tell what hit him the wrong way, and most of the time, we found him watching TV, then going to work, going to church, and coming home to watch more TV and sleep. He always had his son sticking around, and it was extremely hard for me at this point because my husband and I had been talking about moving out for some time before this point and decided that it was now or never. So after he proposed to me on Valentine's Day, I lost my grandfather and we talked it out. My husband and I moved into an apartment. I hated to take my husband away from my Phil, but he was 30 and still living at home, and with us talking about starting a family, it needed to be done. I know that with my husband gone, my Phil was hurting not being around his son as much as he was used to. He was vulnerable, and that was when the monster slithered into existence. I couldn't tell you how she came up. As mentioned before, I don't remember a time that my Phil didn't just work and come home. But, however it happened, she seemed to make him smile again with her silly antics. She was childish and made him feel young. Even now, we all wish we could have just convinced him that it was the grief taking over him, and he eventually learned it for himself. Our first ever meeting with this woman was at the house. The only way to describe her was a timid mouse scurrying about because people came near her. She supposedly suffered from severe anxiety and social problems. I say supposedly because she was a notorious liar and had a ton of medical issues that she lied about all the time. The meeting was brief, and we hardly got to talk to her if at all. But during that time, Phil explained a few things like this was just a fling, nothing is going to come out of it, and basically convincing himself that it wasn't serious. Until it was. My Phil had two major issues that we didn't know about. This girl was a terrible listener. Yes, she made him feel young and made my Phil smile again for the first time in a while, but this whole arrangement was because he told her that when she took her medication, which was known to make her extremely drowsy, Phil did not want her driving. It was dangerous, reckless, and could have hurt a lot of people, not just her. So he told her that when she took this medication, she could spend the night. However, to her, this meant that she never had to go home. The second issue was my Phil was Mormon, and whether you yourself are religious or not, there are certain rules that you are supposed to follow when you are religious. In the Mormon religion, you could not live in the same house as the opposing sex without being married, or that person being a daughter, son, family of some kind. It was seen as indecent and a major no-no. My Phil was a pastor. If anyone found out about what happened, he would lose everything that he held dear about his religion. He loved his church, he loved his people, and he didn't want to be seen as something he wasn't because some woman had forced her way into his life. For any of you who may not understand, my Phil is a non-confrontational man. It was so much harder for him to tell her to leave than it was to marry her to keep the peace. Another big part of this was he was missing that connection that he was so used to after all these years. So fast forward a little bit. My Phil called us over. I was prone to social anxiety myself, but usually fought through those anxieties to be around family. So if my Phil called my husband, he usually asked me to come along so he wasn't alone. When we get there, she is sitting in the car and my Phil is standing outside the car. He asked my husband for his blessings, and immediately, I mean like she was gone in a flash, Monster whipped the seat backwards so she was no longer showing through the window at all. All of us had a brief laugh at her craziness, but it definitely struck a huge flag with my husband and me. My husband's words to him were, "If she makes you happy, then don't let me stand in your way." However, going home, my husband relayed to me all of the things he felt unsure or unconfident about. I simply tried to remind him that Phil was an adult and could handle himself. Shortly after this exchange, however, everything was planned for their wedding. Her previous divorce was finalized, and we even helped gather her things. The drive brought another multitude of issues that did not sit well with me, but I remained casual. She told me about why they were getting a divorce in the first place. According to her, her ex-husband was sneaky and did some terrible things to go against her in court. She admitted to being not so good a mother, and on this drive even confessed that she hit her son so hard that he flew across the room at one point. She had apparently held her kids down to the ground to prevent them from getting into fights with their father, and a multitude of other things that seemed off. So trying to be the mediator, I told her that if what she said is true, then her kids will come to see it. This woman was an amazing actress, and her tears are quite good at pulling people into her sob story, but the one thing that popped out to me was her daughter. This daughter was conceived by another man in a previous fling relationship. Through multiple ways, I found out that she never wanted to see or speak to her mother because of physical, mental, verbal, and drug abuse. And during Monster's time with my Phil, we found out that she even went as far as to send threatening messages from my Phil's phone. My Phil had no idea she had done this either, and when she would explain herself, she would constantly tell us that she didn't know how to properly talk to people over the phone because of her social anxieties. This monster was lazy, combative, a consistent liar, and all kinds of wrong. Again, all things that we had no idea about until it was too late. My brother-in-law witnessed this firsthand after moving back in with their father to be there for him when my husband moved out before Monster moved in. During a family camping trip, I was invited by Monster because she did not want to feel like the only girl on a camping trip. I love camping and have since I was much smaller, so I figured it would be a nice breakaway if my husband and other family didn't mind. They didn't. However, when the time came, I was the one who went as the only girl on this trip. This was one of many times she would try and fake illnesses to get out of things that were not directly planned by her. If this wasn't bad enough, during the entire trip, she would blow up my Phil's phone and try to talk to him as though she wasn't welcomed. At one point, she even got extremely mad that he didn't clean up the house before he left on this camping trip with us. I remind everyone of two things. One, she had no job, no work, and nothing to do all day long but dirty all of the dishes for her baking career. My Phil works 12 plus hours in the medical field, at least 5 days a week, sometimes 6, and then came home to her arguing and shouting that he wasn't cleaning up the house. He was also forced to take care of the dog that she wanted, clean all the dishes that she made throughout the day, and do any other manual laboring tasks that she wanted to get done, but would never lift a finger to help. Eventually, her arguing had my Phil drive all the way back home from camping just so they could be together for the night. She was the one who decided not to come to this thing, even after begging me to come along so she had some company. Needless to say, this was another major red flag for us, and my Bill, husband, and I was not very happy with how she was acting. However, this was still fairly early on in the relationship, and not even the beginning of the torment we would receive. Interested in more? Let me know down below for part 3, my monstrous background wedding.
This story is going to get interesting and thrilling with each part, so don't miss out on the twists and turns in each of these parts. See you in the next part 3, Monstrous Wedding. Stay safe and stay